How did you get interested in the space field, especially the development side, the commercial side? But are you one of those people who was interested in space exploration as a child, or was it something that came to you later in life?
I got infected with this bug as a kid. Actually, in my early years on high school, I read Malthus. We had economics doctrination of these sorts of principles, and it seemed to me very clear that Malthus was a 17th century economist who spoke about what happens with nation states as they expand and overexpand from a resource and logistics perspective in those feudal eras. And being such a space nut, generally, having really reinforced the bug, I think, when watching Star Wars and so many different visions of where we can take civilization, positive or negative, and obviously we strive for the former. It did seem to me that a huge calling was, well, how do we open up the resources of the solar system and beyond so that we can flourish as a civilization and expand our ability to grow and not be limited. So this is very much a lifelong pursuit.
It's interesting you mentioned starting with Malthus, because one of my mentors, Gerard K. O'Neill, was inspired by the limits to growth study in the early 70s. I think the limits to growth people would say they were not Malthusians, but they were accused of it, certainly. And in many ways, I think O'Neill was inspired by that, the way you were inspired by the concerns that Malthus raised. So,
exactly, yeah. And I think the challenge is, especially more so today, this week, this year, this decade. The questions of the limits we face as a civilization in our terrestrial sphere of influence and concern it is almost the biggest question we can ask and requires the most urgency to address. And I'm not sure we are doing that intelligently and systematically, so that the most prudent and objectively viable solutions can emerge. Right now, I think we have a lot of groupthink going on, and the clock is ticking.
Yeah. Well, you've tackled an area that I think does not get as much attention as it deserves, and that really is robotics and artificial intelligence. AI has certainly come into the consciousness in the last 5 months, but not so much in relationship to the space enterprise. How did you decide that your focus would be in this particular domain?
Yes. So my early years were spent on satellite design and launch, having worked on the launch of over a dozen spacecraft to low Earth orbit. And that after doing that for well over a decade, I needed to take it to a different direction, a more entrepreneurial direction. So I started several startups, learned a lot of lessons. The greatest currency I gained was experience. But I gained a lot of lessons learned. And my previous startup to OffWorld, Shackleton Energy Company, the plan was for 6 of us to build ice mining rigs on the south pole of the moon, take the propellant we need to get there, and effectively harvest and refine the propellant we needed to get back to Earth. So a real Lewis and Clark expedition that would set the premise of an in-space logistics, transportation, and propellant infrastructure. Now, we costed all over that over a period of a number of years to a $18 billion program. This is from 2008 onwards. And it was very difficult to raise capital for something like that. So, but I went out naively with my co-founders to push that premise and test the premise, really. Eventually, we did raise some initial funds from a sovereign leader who was keen to expand into a proposal for an entire space-based solar power architecture around the planet by before the end of the century. This would involve setting up the propellant supply chain, the lunar manufacturing for scalable space solar power built outside Earth's atmosphere, and then the establishment of that architecture over the subsequent 50 to 60 years. After about a year of significant mobilization, that also fell apart under its own weight. There was risk reduction exercises, and it was too much to lift. But we came close. We came very close to establishing the world's most significant and important infrastructure program in human history. And that fight is not over. We are still mobilizing on that. But I drew out several lessons from that. One is there's no such thing as a space business. There's only business. Yeah. So however grand or altruistic or important the mission might be, if it doesn't meet the metrics of scaling economics, there's no way you can mobilize funds from the early and late majority of capital providers who will care about what you're doing but won't back it financially. So you need to be smart. So that was the first lesson. And the second lesson I kind of drew from this was you have to prove things. You have to lead the way and prove things out before others will follow. So having an idea or having a vision is part of the picture, but you need execution and implementation to close the cognitive dissonance gap. So building it was then clear to me. So when I decided to bring my efforts at Shackleton Energy to a close, I thought, well, what are the real lessons learned? Well, there were two main areas to that. The first was, for an ideal space industrialization program, for it to be economical, viable, startable, and scalable, there are 4 constraining categories. You had to have no people present in situ doing repetitive command and control work, whether it was physically manipulating tools, remote controlling, or even teleoperating from a distance. The second is, because of that, you should ideally minimize any fixed infrastructure. Don't try and build fixed infrastructure in the early days. Thirdly, avoid or minimize the consumables you need and just use what you can locate locally. And the fourth was leave no environmental footprint, not just for good practice and good cultural ethics, but also electrostatic regolith is something you want to avoid flying around. And so with those 4 constraints, and adding that there's only real business that can mobilize scaling, I then proceeded on a long search for the nearest planet with aliens with bank accounts. So it happened that we are actually sitting on a very viable celestial body. And if you build a space program that is environmentally agnostic, your systems development, your hardware, software, intelligence layers, and interface to human operations will be consistent from a systems perspective, and it's only the environmental deltas that you need to engineer for and account for. So in order to build civilization out into the solar system, into the stars, we knew we needed to be able to undertake mining and harvesting, processing and fabrication, construction and manufacturing, the foundations of industrial endeavor. So we designed and architected a single platform. We looked at nature. We architected a swarming configuration of robots that are modular in their archetype, use common subsystems, power, comms, data handling, articulation, software, command and control, intelligence, etc. But the modules can be interchangeable, and any function that's necessary for the building of industrial civilization can be built with this industrial Lego kit, a solar system toolkit, if you like. And so we created a subset for the mining sector called the Swarm Robotic Mining System, and literally went and banged on the doors of some mining companies and managed to find an excellent kickoff partner in one of the big mining companies who, although being skeptical, to immense credit, they gave us the chance and opportunity to prove ourselves. And with that great relationship, we managed to kick off what we're building and expand it to other companies. And we have just signed a major lunar mining contract last week. And the press release of that will go out mid-April.
That's great.
So we're actually the world's first company to have mining development contracts on 2 celestial bodies.
Well, congratulations on that. That's really great. A couple of comments on what you just said. There is no space business. I think you said there's only business. And I went to an MIT conference maybe 7 years ago, and one of the speakers, whose name I don't recall, said, if you want to be successful in space business, drop the word space. And it's kind of what you just said.
Yes.